Rich woman yells at Maid's kids, later finds out the truth about them. Have you ever judged someone based on a single moment, only to be stunned by the truth later? What if the person you looked down on turned out to be someone you should have respected all along? This is the story of a wealthy woman who yelled at her maid's children, thinking they were nothing more than a nuisance, only to discover their true identities and the incredible legacy they carried. It's a story about assumptions, regrets, and the shocking power of what's hidden beneath the surface. The grand mansion stood at the edge of the city, its towering columns and pristine garden a symbol of wealth and power. Inside, the air smelled of fresh flowers and polished wood, and the walls were adorned with priceless paintings. The floors gleamed under the soft light of chandeliers, casting elegant shadows on the furniture. It was the kind of home that most people only dreamed of, a sanctuary for the rich and influential. In the kitchen, a young woman named Laura moved quickly, trying to get dinner ready before the family returned from their afternoon outing. She was no stranger to hard work, having spent years cleaning, cooking, and organizing for the high-profile family she worked for. Laura had a quiet strength about her, and while the work was demanding, she had learned to cope with the long hours and the weight of her responsibilities. Her two children, Emily and James, were playing in the small backyard behind the house. They were not in school that day because of a minor illness, and Laura had allowed them to stay home while she worked. The kids weren't disruptive, but their presence in the yard didn't go unnoticed by Mrs. Wilkins, the homeowner. Mrs. Wilkins, a wealthy woman in her mid-50s, was as well known for her arrogance as she was for her vast fortune. She lived with a sense of entitlement that often bled into how she treated others, particularly those who worked for her. Laura had always been polite, diligent, and respectful, but Mrs. Wilkins rarely returned the courtesy. The children, in her eyes, were just another reminder of the lower class she believed herself to be so far above. One afternoon, as Laura worked in the kitchen, Mrs. Wilkins stormed into the backyard, her heels clicking loudly on the marble floors. She didn't even acknowledge Laura as she passed by her. "Laura!" Mrs. Wilkins called, her voice dripping with disdain. "Your children are making too much noise outside. They're disturbing my peace." Laura, wiping her hands on her apron, stepped into the living room to see what the fuss was about. She saw Emily and James sitting on the grass, giggling and playing with a ball. They were far from being loud, but Mrs. Wilkins was already fuming. "They're not even in school, and they're wasting their time here making noise," Mrs. Wilkins continued, her voice raised. "I pay you to clean my house, not to have your children running wild in my yard. How dare you allow this?" Laura felt her heart sink. She knew better than to argue, but it hurt to hear Mrs. Wilkins speak about her children in such a cruel way. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Wilkins," she said softly. "I'll tell them to quiet down." But Mrs. Wilkins wasn't done. "You don't seem to understand how things work, do you? You're lucky I even let you work here. I could replace you in a second if I wanted to." Laura took a deep breath, trying to stay calm. She had learned to keep her composure in these situations, but the words stung. As much as she wanted to defend her children and herself, she knew the power dynamics at play. The woman who paid her wages controlled her livelihood, and it was a constant reminder of the divide between them. "Please, Mrs. Wilkins, they're just children," Laura said quietly. But Mrs. Wilkins shook her head dismissively. "Children of people like you shouldn't be in my yard at all. They don't belong here. You better make sure they stay out of sight from now on, or I'll be forced to take further action." Laura bit her lip and nodded, holding back the tears that threatened to come. She couldn't afford to lose this job, but her heart ached for her children. They didn't deserve to be treated like this. The next day, Laura made sure the children stayed inside, not wanting to provoke Mrs. Wilkins further. Emily and James, though young, understood that their mother was upset. They quietly played with their toys in the corner of the living room, trying their best not to make any noise. Laura, for her part, continued her work as usual, though her mind was heavy with the unfairness of it all. Mrs. Wilkins continued her usual routine, hovering around the house like a hawk. She kept an eye on everything, from the dust on the furniture to the state of the garden. Her mood grew darker by the hour as if something was weighing on her mind. Laura, too, noticed this shift but didn't dare bring it up. She simply kept her head down, determined to make it through the day. But by mid-afternoon, the atmosphere shifted once again. Mrs. Wilkins entered the kitchen, her usual cold demeanor replaced by an air of authority. "Laura," she said sharply, "I need to speak with you." Laura straightened up, sensing that something was wrong. "Yes, Mrs. Wilkins." "There's someone coming to visit me soon," Mrs. Wilkins said, her voice icy. "I expect you to make sure everything is perfect, and keep your children out of sight. No one needs to know they're here." Laura nodded, but something in Mrs. Wilkins' tone felt off. "Of course," she replied, though she couldn't shake the feeling that this was more than just a simple request. A few hours later, as the clock ticked closer to dinner, the doorbell rang. Mrs. Wilkins stood at the door to greet her visitor, a tight smile on her face. As she opened the door, she was met with a man in his mid-40s, dressed in a sharp suit, his presence commanding. "Good afternoon, Mrs. Wilkins," the man said, extending his hand. "It's a pleasure to finally meet you in person." Mrs. Wilkins, though surprised by his sudden appearance, quickly recovered her composure. "Ah, yes, Mr. Lancaster," she said, her voice oozing with charm. "Please come in." But it wasn't just Mr. Lancaster who entered the house. A young girl, no older than 14, followed behind him. She had striking features, dark, curly hair and sharp eyes that seemed to absorb everything around her. She walked confidently, her posture regal, as though she belonged there just as much as anyone else. Mrs. Wilkins greeted them both, but as she looked at the girl, something about her seemed familiar. The resemblance to someone she knew gnawed at the back of her mind, but she couldn't quite place it. As the evening went on, Mrs. Wilkins did her best to entertain her guests. She barely noticed when Emily and James came down to the kitchen to grab a snack, but when the young girl saw them, her eyes widened, and she turned to Mr. Lancaster, her expression changing. She spoke in a low voice, too quiet for Mrs. Wilkins to overhear. "Are they?" the girl began, looking from the children to Mrs. Wilkins. Mr. Lancaster nodded, a small smile playing on his lips. "Yes. You don't remember, do you?" Mrs. Wilkins, overhearing the conversation, raised an eyebrow. "What's going on here?" she asked, her tone laced with suspicion. The young girl turned to face her. "You don't recognize them, do you? These are my siblings, the children of my mother, Laura." Mrs. Wilkins froze. "What?" she gasped, looking from the girl to the children in shock. It suddenly clicked. The girl's eyes, her hair, the way she carried herself, they were all familiar now. Mrs. Wilkins's face drained of color as the truth hit her. The young girl wasn't just anyone. She was the daughter of the woman she had disrespected for years. You're Laura's daughter?" Mrs. Wilkins stammered, her voice shaking. "Yes, I am," the girl replied calmly. "And these are my siblings, Emily and James. You've treated my mother horribly over the years, and now we're here to see how you're going to make things right." The room grew still. The tension in the air was palpable, as though everyone in the room was holding their breath. Mrs. Wilkins had never felt so small in her life. Her arrogance, her assumptions, had come back to haunt her in the most unexpected way. The young girl, Laura's daughter, was not just a child of a maid. She was the heir to a vast fortune, the granddaughter of one of the wealthiest families in the country. Laura had been a caretaker, yes, but she had never been as simple as Mrs. Wilkins had thought. Her family's legacy was powerful, and now Mrs. Wilkins was going to face the consequences of her callous behavior. I didn't know," Mrs. Wilkins said, her voice trembling. "Now you do," the girl replied firmly, "and we expect an apology for all the years you've treated our mother like she was nothing." Mrs. Wilkins learned an invaluable lesson that day. It's easy to judge someone based on appearances or status, but the truth can be far more complicated than it seems. Laura, the woman she had disrespected, had come from a background that no one could have guessed. And as for the children, they were not just the offspring of a maid. They were the heirs to a powerful legacy, and their mother had sacrificed much to keep them safe and loved. Mrs. Wilkins was left to reflect on her actions, realizing how quickly her assumptions had led to her downfall. She had underestimated the power of family, respect, and the unspoken strength that people carry within them. Never judge a person based on their appearance or status. You never know who they are, who they're related to, or the incredible story they carry with them. The truth always has a way of revealing itself, and when it does, it can change everything.